Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, a South African anti-apartheid revolutionary and politician, is one of the most iconic figures in the fight for racial equality. Born in 1918, Mandela was a leader in the African National Congress, ANC, and a key figure in the fight against South Africa's apartheid system of institutionalized racial segregation and oppression. Mandela was first arrested in 1962 for leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. While serving this sentence, he was charged with sabotage and other crimes during the Rivonia trial, 1963-1964, where he and several ANC leaders were accused of plotting to overthrow the apartheid government. In 1964, Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to Robben Island, a notorious prison near Cape Town. During his imprisonment, Mandela became a global symbol of resistance to oppression. Despite being behind bars, his influence on the anti-apartheid movement grew. After 27 years in prison, intense domestic and international pressure, including widespread economic sanctions, forced the South African government to negotiate. Mandela was finally released on February 11, 1990. His release marked the beginning of the end of apartheid, and he later became South Africa's first black president in 1994. Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi, born in 1869, was a leader of India's struggle for independence from British rule. Known for his philosophy of nonviolence, ahimsa, and civil disobedience, Gandhi became the face of the Indian freedom movement. Gandhi was arrested multiple times by the British colonial authorities for organizing and leading peaceful protests. One of the most significant instances was his arrest in 1930 during the Salt March. The march was a 240-mile journey to the Arabian Sea, where Gandhi and his followers made salt in defiance of British laws that imposed a tax on salt production. This act of civil disobedience gained global attention. Gandhi was arrested on May 5, 1930, in Gujarat, and spent time in Yerwada jail. His arrests were part of a broader strategy by the British to suppress the Indian independence movement. Gandhi used his time in prison to write, strategize, and inspire others. He was often released due to political pressure, his deteriorating health, or as part of negotiations between the British and Indian leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., born in 1929, was a leader of the American civil rights movement, advocating for racial equality through nonviolent resistance. King's leadership in landmark events like the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956, and the March on Washington, 1963, made him a central figure in the fight against racial segregation in the United States. King was arrested numerous times for his activism. One of the most notable arrests occurred in Birmingham, Alabama, in April 1963. King had organized nonviolent protests against racial segregation in the city, which was notorious for its discriminatory practices. He was arrested on April 12 for violating a court injunction against demonstrations. While in jail, King wrote the famous Letter from Birmingham Jail, defending the strategy of nonviolent resistance and addressing criticisms from white clergy who believed the protests were untimely. The letter became a seminal document in the civil rights movement. King was eventually released on April 20, 1963, after 8 days in jail, largely due to national and international pressure on the authorities. His courage and writings during his imprisonment galvanized support for the civil rights movement, leading to significant legislative victories like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi, born in 1945, is a political leader and Nobel Peace Prize laureate from Myanmar, formerly Burma. She is the daughter of Aung San, the founder of modern Myanmar. Suu Kyi emerged as a prominent pro-democracy activist in the late 1980s, opposing Myanmar's military junta that ruled with an iron fist. Suu Kyi was first placed under house arrest in July 1989 after her political party, the National League for Democracy, NLD, gained significant momentum in opposing the military government. The junta viewed her popularity as a threat to its authority. Over the next 2 decades, she spent nearly 15 years under house arrest, often in isolation, without access to her family or the outside world. Her arrests were carried out without formal charges, using laws that allowed indefinite detention for threats to public peace. The international community, including the United Nations, heavily criticized her detentions. Despite her incarceration, the NLD won a landslide victory in the 1990 elections, but the military refused to relinquish power. Suu Kyi was finally released in November 2010 as Myanmar began a transition toward partial democracy. She later became the de facto leader of Myanmar in 2015, though her reputation has been tarnished internationally due to her handling of the Rohingya crisis. Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, born in 1874, was a British politician, army officer, and writer who later became one of the most celebrated prime ministers of the United Kingdom. Known for his leadership during World War II, Churchill had an adventurous early career that included journalism and military service. Churchill was captured and imprisoned during the Second Boer War in 1899. At the time, he was working as a war correspondent for the Morning Post in South Africa. While accompanying British troops, his train was ambushed by Boer forces near Chivli. Churchill was taken as a prisoner of war and held in a converted school in Pretoria. Despite the significant risk, Churchill managed a daring escape in December 1899. He scaled the prison walls and traveled hundreds of miles by train and on foot, with the help of sympathetic locals, eventually reaching Portuguese East Africa, now Mozambique. His escape turned him into a national hero in Britain and helped launch his political career. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, commonly known as Lula, was born in 1945 and served as the president of Brazil from 2003 to 2011. Coming from a humble background, Lula rose through the ranks as a union leader and became a founding member of the Workers' Party, PT. In 2017, Lula was convicted of corruption and money laundering as part of Brazil's massive Operation Car Wash investigation, which uncovered widespread corruption in the state-run oil company Petrobras. He was accused of receiving bribes in the form of a luxury apartment and other benefits in exchange for political favors. Lula was arrested in April 2018 and began serving a 12-year prison sentence in Curitiba. However, his imprisonment was controversial, with many viewing it as politically motivated to prevent him from running in the 2018 presidential election. During his time in prison, he maintained his innocence and continued to influence Brazilian politics. In November 2019, Brazil's Supreme Court ruled that defendants could not be imprisoned until all appeals were exhausted. As a result, Lula was released after spending 580 days in prison. In 2021, the Supreme Court annulled his convictions, allowing him to return to politics and later win the presidency again in 2022. Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, born in 1870, was a Russian revolutionary and the leader of the Bolshevik Party, which spearheaded the October Revolution of 1917. He is regarded as the architect of the Soviet Union and a prominent theorist of Marxism-Leninism. Lenin was arrested multiple times during his revolutionary activities against the Tsarist regime in Russia. One notable arrest occurred in December 1895, when Lenin and other members of the Union of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class were detained for distributing Marxist literature and organizing workers' strikes in St. Petersburg. Lenin spent over a year in prison before being sentenced to 3 years of exile in Siberia. While in Siberia, Lenin continued his revolutionary work, writing articles, planning strategy, and maintaining contact with other Marxists. After his release in 1900, he fled to Western Europe, where he continued organizing and publishing revolutionary material. Lenin's arrests and exiles hardened his resolve and helped him refine his revolutionary ideology, culminating in the overthrow of the Russian monarchy in 1917. Jawaharlal Nehru. Jawaharlal Nehru, born in 1889, was a central figure in India's struggle for independence from British colonial rule, and later became the first Prime Minister of independent India. A close associate of Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru played a pivotal role in the Indian National Congress, INC, and its campaigns of civil disobedience against British rule. Nehru was arrested several times during the freedom movement. One of the most notable instances was during the Quit India movement of 1942, a mass protest demanding an immediate end to British rule. The movement led to widespread arrests, including the detention of Nehru and the entire Congress leadership. Nehru was imprisoned on August 9, 1942, and sent to Ahmednagar Fort Prison, where he spent nearly 3 years, the longest single incarceration of his life. During his time in prison, Nehru wrote extensively, including his famous book, The Discovery of India, which explored India's history, culture, and his vision for its future. He was released in June 1945, along with other leaders, as the British began negotiations for India's independence. Nehru's repeated imprisonments solidified his position as a national leader and symbol of resistance against colonialism. Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, born in 1926, was a Cuban revolutionary who led the overthrow of the Batista regime and served as the leader of Cuba from 1959 to 2008. Castro's revolutionary activities began in the early 1950s when he organized an armed rebellion against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. On July 26, 1953, Castro and around 150 followers launched an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The assault, aimed at inciting a popular uprising, failed disastrously, and most of the rebels were killed or captured. Castro was arrested shortly after and tried alongside his brother Raúl. During his trial, Castro delivered his famous "History Will Absolve Me" speech, defending his actions and outlining his revolutionary vision for Cuba. Castro was sentenced to 15 years in prison but was released in 1955 after serving less than 2 years, following a general amnesty granted by the Batista government under public pressure. After his release, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he regrouped and prepared for the Cuban Revolution, which eventually succeeded in January 1959. His arrest and subsequent trial turned him into a revolutionary icon, laying the groundwork for his eventual rise to power. Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, born in 1889, was the leader of the Nazi Party and later the dictator of Germany from 1933 to 1945. Hitler's arrest occurred after the failed Beer Hall Putsch, an attempted coup to overthrow the Weimar Republic. The putsch, carried out in Munich on November 8–9, 1923, involved Hitler and other members of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, marching with paramilitary forces to seize power. The coup failed when police forces opened fire on the marchers, killing 16 Nazis and arresting several, including Hitler. He was charged with high treason and tried in early 1924. During his trial, Hitler used the courtroom as a platform to promote his ideology, gaining national attention. On April 1, 1924, Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, though he served only 9 months. During his imprisonment, he wrote Mein Kampf, a manifesto outlining his political beliefs and plans for Germany's future. Upon his early release in December 1924, Hitler shifted tactics, focusing on gaining power through legal means. His brief imprisonment ultimately bolstered his public profile and helped him consolidate his position as the leader of the Nazi movement. Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek, born in 1887, was a Chinese military leader and politician who led the Republic of China during a turbulent period marked by the Chinese Civil War and the Second Sino-Japanese War. Despite his authoritarian leadership, Chiang's political career included a dramatic episode of detention during the Xi'an incident in 1936. Chiang was detained by 2 of his own generals, Zhang Xueliang and Yang Hucheng, who were dissatisfied with his prioritization of fighting the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, over resisting Japanese aggression. They kidnapped him on December 12, 1936 in Xi'an, demanding that he form a united front with the Communists against Japan. The incident caused a national and international stir. After intense negotiations, facilitated by intermediaries including Communist leader Zhou Enlai, Chiang was released on December 25, 1936. He reluctantly agreed to the United Front, marking a temporary alliance between the nationalists and communists against Japan. The Xi'an incident was a turning point in China's fight against Japanese occupation and solidified Chiang's control over the nationalist government. Patrice Lumumba. Patrice Lumumba, born in 1925, was the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, and a leading figure in the country's struggle for independence from Belgium. Lumumba's arrest occurred during the Congo Crisis, a tumultuous period following the country's independence in June 1960. After assuming office, Lumumba's government faced severe challenges, including a mutiny in the army and secessionist movements in Katanga and South Kasai, both backed by Belgium. His anti-colonial stance and alignment with the Soviet Union alarmed Western powers and local rivals. In September 1960, he was dismissed by President Joseph Kasavubu, and on December 1st, Lumumba was captured by forces loyal to Colonel Joseph Mobutu, later Mobutu Sese Seko, while attempting to escape to Stanleyville, now Kisangani. Lumumba was imprisoned and later transferred to Katanga, where he was tortured and executed on January 17, 1961, by secessionist forces with the complicity of Belgian officers. His death was widely condemned, and he remains a symbol of anti-imperialism and African unity. Angela Davis. Angela Davis, born in 1944, is an American political activist, scholar, and prominent figure in the fight for civil rights and prison reform. Davis became a controversial symbol of resistance to systemic racism and state oppression during the 1960s and 1970s. Davis was arrested on October 13, 1970, after being implicated in a courthouse shootout in Marin County, California, in which a judge and 3 others were killed. The weapons used in the incident were registered in Davis's name, though she was not present at the scene. She was charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder, largely due to her association with the Black Panthers and her support for the Soledad brothers, 3 African-American inmates accused of killing a prison guard. Davis fled California and became one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives before being apprehended in New York City. After spending 16 months in jail, Davis was acquitted of all charges in 1972. Her trial garnered international attention and became a rallying point for civil rights activists. Following her release, Davis became an advocate for prison abolition and social justice, continuing to challenge systemic inequalities in the United States. Robert Mugabe. Robert Mugabe, born in 1924, was a Zimbabwean revolutionary who became the country's first prime minister in 1980, and later, its president. Mugabe's political career began as a leader of the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, a nationalist movement fighting against British colonial rule and the white minority government of Rhodesia. In 1964, Mugabe was arrested by Rhodesian authorities for his involvement in anti-colonial activities and spent over a decade in detention. He was charged with making subversive statements and inciting rebellion. During his imprisonment, Mugabe studied extensively, earning degrees in law and economics through correspondence. Despite being behind bars, Mugabe continued to lead ZANU, communicating with his followers and strengthening the liberation movement. Mugabe was released in 1974 under international pressure and the political shift toward negotiations for Rhodesian independence. Following his release, he played a key role in leading the armed struggle that culminated in Zimbabwe's independence in 1980. Mugabe's long imprisonment bolstered his revolutionary credentials and paved the way for his rise to power, though his later years in office were marked by controversy and authoritarian rule. Emmeline Pankhurst. Emmeline Pankhurst, born in 1858, was a British political activist and leader of the suffragette movement, which campaigned for women's right to vote in the United Kingdom. Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, in 1903, a militant organization that used confrontational tactics to draw attention to the cause. Pankhurst was arrested numerous times for her activism, particularly for acts of civil disobedience, including protests, hunger strikes, and property damage. One notable arrest occurred in 1912 after a series of window-smashing demonstrations in London. She was charged with conspiracy and sentenced to several months in prison. During her incarcerations, Pankhurst and other suffragettes went on hunger strikes to protest their treatment, often resulting in forced feeding by prison authorities. The government responded by passing the so-called Cat and Mouse Act, allowing the temporary release of hunger-striking suffragettes to recover before rearresting them. Pankhurst's persistence and willingness to endure imprisonment helped galvanize public support for women's suffrage. In 1918, women over the age of 30 were granted the right to vote in Britain, a victory attributed in part to the sacrifices made by Pankhurst and her fellow suffragettes. José Mujica. José Mujica, born in 1935, is a former president of Uruguay, 2010-2015, and a former guerrilla fighter with the leftist Tupamaros movement. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Tupamaros waged an armed struggle against Uruguay's military dictatorship, aiming to create a more equitable society. Mujica was arrested several times during his guerrilla activities. In 1972, he was captured after being injured in a shootout with police. Following his arrest, Mujica was held under harsh conditions for over 13 years, much of which was spent in solitary confinement. His imprisonment, along with that of other Tupamaro leaders, symbolized the military regime's crackdown on dissent. Mujica reportedly survived by cultivating mental resilience and finding solace in simple routines. He was released in 1985, following the restoration of democracy in Uruguay. Mujica renounced armed struggle and entered politics, becoming a senator and later president. His time in prison shaped his outlook, leading him to embrace humility, simplicity, and dialogue as key values during his presidency, earning him admiration worldwide for his austere lifestyle and progressive policies. Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez, born in 1954, was a Venezuelan military officer and politician who served as president of Venezuela from 1999 until his death in 2013. Chavez's political career began with his involvement in a failed coup attempt in 1992 against President Carlos Andrés Pérez, whom Chavez accused of corruption and mismanagement during an economic crisis. On February 4, 1992, Chavez and his co-conspirators launched the coup, targeting key government institutions. Although Chavez's faction managed to seize some strategic locations, the coup ultimately failed, and Chavez surrendered, famously stating, "For now, the objectives we set for ourselves have not been achieved." He was arrested and imprisoned at the San Carlos military stockade. Chavez spent 2 years in prison before being pardoned in 1994 by President Rafael Caldera as part of a broader effort to promote national reconciliation. Following his release, Chavez turned to democratic politics, founding the Fifth Republic movement and eventually winning the presidency in 1998. His time in prison solidified his image as a revolutionary and propelled his political career, leading to significant changes in Venezuelan society and politics during his tenure. Alexei Navalny. Alexei Navalny, born in 1976, is a Russian opposition leader, lawyer, and anti-corruption activist who has become one of the most prominent critics of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Navalny has exposed corruption at the highest levels of government and organized mass protests, which have made him a frequent target of political repression. Navalny has been arrested numerous times for his activism. One of the most notable instances occurred in January 2021, when he was detained upon returning to Russia after recovering from a near-fatal poisoning with a nerve agent in Germany, an attack widely attributed to Russian authorities. He was immediately arrested at the airport for allegedly violating parole conditions related to a previous conviction, which many view as politically motivated. In February 2021, Navalny was sentenced to 2.5 years in a penal colony. While in prison, Navalny has continued to speak out against the Russian government, using his platform to inspire further resistance. His imprisonment has drawn international condemnation, with governments and human rights organizations calling for his release. Navalny's resilience in the face of state persecution has made him a symbol of opposition to authoritarianism in Russia. Kim Dae-jung. Kim Dae-jung, born in 1924, was a South Korean politician, democracy activist, and Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He served as the president of South Korea from 1998 to 2003 and is remembered for his efforts to promote democracy and reconciliation on the Korean peninsula. Kim faced political persecution throughout his career. In 1971, after losing a tightly contested presidential election against authoritarian leader Park Chung-hee, Kim became a target of government repression. In 1973, he was kidnapped by South Korean intelligence agents while in exile in Japan. The agents planned to assassinate him by throwing him into the sea, but international pressure, particularly from the US, saved his life. Kim was later arrested multiple times under the dictatorship of Chun Doo-hwan, who came to power in 1980. Following the Gwangju Uprising, a pro-democracy protest brutally suppressed by the military, Kim was accused of inciting rebellion and sentenced to death in 1980. Massive domestic and international outrage, including interventions from the US and the Vatican, led to his sentence being commuted to life imprisonment and eventually to exile in 1982. Kim returned to South Korea in 1985 and continued his fight for democracy, eventually leading the country as president. His resilience and commitment to democratic values earned him global admiration, and his presidency marked a turning point in South Korea's history. Evo Morales. Evo Morales, born in 1959, is a Bolivian politician and activist who served as the country's first indigenous president from 2006 to 2019. Morales, a former coca farmer, rose to prominence as a leader of the Coca Growers Union and a staunch advocate for indigenous rights and anti-imperialism. Morales was arrested in the 1990s during his early political activism. He became a vocal opponent of US-backed coca eradication programs, which sought to eliminate coca cultivation in Bolivia as part of the war on drugs. These programs disproportionately affected indigenous farmers, sparking widespread protests. Morales was detained multiple times by Bolivian authorities for organizing demonstrations and resisting eradication efforts, including an arrest in 1994 during a protest in Cochabamba. Despite his arrests, Morales continued to build a political base and eventually co-founded the Movement for Socialism. His activism and grassroots support propelled him to the presidency in 2006. Morales used his platform to challenge neoliberal policies and promote indigenous empowerment, though his later years in office were marked by controversy over his extended rule. I know you were expecting more video like this. So, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps me bringing you more content.